Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and today I am reviewing this katana made by RyanSword. Now, a couple things you should know about this. First off, this is a review sample. I did not pay any money for this sword. I had reached out to RyanSword asking if they wanted to provide a review sample, and they gave me the choice of a couple different swords that they had in stock in their California warehouse at the time, and I chose this one primarily because I like the way it looks. It is their $135 Kill Bill Hattori Hanzo inspired katana. Now, I did not choose it because it's Kill Bill. I mean, I watched both Kill Bill movies, but that was 2 decades ago. So I haven't ever rewatched them. I wasn't particularly enamored with the movies. They were fine, but that's pretty much it. The movies didn't leave a large impression on me. So I didn't pick this sword because of the movie. I picked it because I like the way it looks. So I'm not going to be talking about how this sword compares to the one in the movies because, frankly, I don't know those movies very well. I'm not going to go through and find them and watch them again because they just didn't leave a strong enough impression on me that I would want to rewatch them. So for the true Kill Bill fans out there, I am sure you will find things that are different from the sword in the movies and this sword here. You know, whether or not that matters to you, that's up to you. I do urge you to keep in mind, this is a $135 sword. You're going to find things that are lacking at that extreme budget of a price. So I'm going to talk about RyanSword for a minute or two here. They are a Longchuan-based company that makes katana and other swords, and they're one of the bigger names when it comes to what I like to call the drop-down custom katana makers. This is where you have makers that have a whole lot of lists of different components that can be put together to make your custom katana. You've got stuff, companies like Hanban, Jaku, Sino Sword, Swords of Northshire, and RyanSword. Those are kind of like the big ones there. However, RyanSword does do more than that. Aside from just their custom katana, they have a whole host of other katana and Japanese-inspired swords and Chinese-inspired swords and some fantasy-inspired swords. They have some that they say are European-inspired. They don't really meet that. They're much more on the fantasy inspiration. But they will also do completely custom work. My friend, the 11 Lance, has put in a couple orders with them to get some pretty interesting things. One of them being an extreme mat cutter katana with just an insane blade width. And my friend Kane Shen did a review of that video, which I will link in the description. So RyanSword does have a good variety of what they can do. And their prices, even for fully custom work, tend to be around $500 or less. You can certainly spend a lot more if you want to start getting into complex steels like sanmai or tamahagane or folded steel, all those different, much more complex steel compositions. But for pretty basic steel and relatively normal design, you're looking at $500 or less. This one, as I said, is $135. That is a very low price for a functional sword. And at that price, I am more willing to excuse flaws that I may find in a sword because you have to account for the fact that the price is so low. The saya on this katana is very iconically designed after the Kill Bill katana, as is pretty much the entire thing. It's got this little design cut out here and another one right here. I don't remember if these designs are accurate or not. My hunch is that they are not because I've seen some people say that they are not, but I haven't myself taken the time to really go look at it. I like the overall look of it. I like the black and gold look. It's a really classic style, so that's kind of why I was drawn to this one. The overall look of the saya is pretty basic. I mean, it does have the cutouts, but there's not a lot of taper to it in any dimension. And there is a little bit of rippling in the lacquer. Not a lot, just a little bit there. Now this Sageo, it came like this, and this is an interesting knot. This is not your standard presentation knot that a lot of katana come with. It's just kind of not sloppily, loosely wrapped. And I'm going to go ahead and unwrap it here so we can take a look at the Sugeo. It's a pretty thin Sugeo. Feels kind of similar to what some people call shoelace Sugeo. It's not quite that bad, but it's certainly not a high quality Sugeo. Budget sword, budget details, you know? Now, I'm kind of curious. Oftentimes, with these budget katana and even much more expensive ones, they will wrap the Sugeo up before the lacquer is fully cured, and you'll get some impressions of the Sugeo in the lacquer. I'm taking a look here. Don't really see that here. And let's see. So the Shidodome come right out. These are going to bang around. If you try to use this, I will probably end up taking them off the saya completely. There's no horn pieces on here. The Kurigata is wood. It doesn't feel like there's an additional piece down here at the Kojiri. And the Koiguchi is wood as well. Now the fit of the sword to the saya, there's a very, very slight rattle. Less this way, more this way, but not too much at all. That's not bad at all. And then if we draw it, it is a little raspy. I don't know if you can make that out. It does rasp a little bit as it's coming out, but not egregiously so. Again, budget, when you're talking about a $135 sword, you're not going to get that amazing fit and finish of something $1,000, $2,000. And this fit seems decent enough to me. And if we hold it upside down, it's not coming out anywhere. The fit of the tension is very, very good. It stays in there, but it takes just a flick of the thumb to draw it out. All right, taking a look at the Tsuka, the koshirae, just how the sword is mounted. Starting with the kashira and the fuchi, I'm going to lump them together because anything that can be said about one of them can be said about both of them. They have a bamboo theme to them with some leaves on it. The bamboo sticks are generally painted gold, and then the leaves are painted silver. The casting quality here is pretty rough. There's a lot of detail that is lost. There's a lot of not crisp details. It's very muddy, very washed out. The molds that these have been cast from have clearly been used a lot. Now, normally that's a criticism, and it's something of a criticism here, but at this price point, you can't really expect really high detail and high quality fittings. It's just not feasible to really do that for most makers. I'm not sure what they're made of. The Suba is listed as made of iron, but there's nothing about what the kashira and fuchi are made of. But it's probably, I'm guessing, brass. That's a very common material on the more budget-oriented katana. The transitions from the fuchi and kashira to the ito are relatively decent. They're not great. There's a little bit of a ledge on both of them on one side, but that ledge has never actually bit my fingers. I've never had any discomfort stem from those ledges. So that it's still functional. It's not been a problem for me. The Tsuka core has a little bit more dimension to it than I would expect at this price point. It starts a little bit wider here and has some very slight taper out towards the kashira. It's not a lot, but it's a subtle detail that makes the Tsuka a little bit more appealing to the eye and a little bit more comfortable to my hands. The Ito itself, the listing doesn't say what it's made of. I am 99% sure this is cotton. The knots here are pretty tight. They're not crazy tight, but they're not loose either. And while I can move them around a little bit, they don't really deform the diamonds at all, and it's not nearly loose enough to be a problem for when I'm using the sword. I would say this is definitely above passing of a grade of Ito tightness. The diamonds, in addition, are relatively even. There's definitely some size difference here and there, but they're pretty well formed overall. The Minuki on here are the two of the exact same design, which is not traditional. Usually they would have a theme, but they would be two different designs. These are the same thing, which is like a bamboo stick with some leaves to mirror the fuchi and koshirae. And they can be moved around by touch by just a tiny bit. They're not loose, I wouldn't say, but they can budge a little bit. I do like the look of them, but again, the casting quality is not particularly high here. They are also placed on the opposite side. Traditionally, the Minuki would rest against your fingertips. Here, they rest in your palms. The Samegawa is real, but it's not inlaid into the Tsuka core and its panels. It's not a full wrap, but that's fine. Again, at $135, this is the kind of thing that you have to accept as a compromise to get it to that price point. There's no real difference in nodule size, really. It's just your basic low quality Samegawa panels, which again is fine. The Tsuba is this very, very simple design that looks a lot nice, in my opinion. It's something that one of my complaints with a lot of budget katana is they go garish on the Tsuba with just bright colors and intricate designs that just in no way work for something that's this low cost. There's oftentimes so much detail in them that it draws the eye to all their flaws. Here, this is a very simple Tsuba, and it's well executed. It's probably laser cut out or water jet cut out, something like that. But everything's been cleaned up. There's no sharp ledges here. I can run my fingers along, and it's not catching the skin at all. So it's a nice, effective Tsuba. I like the way this looks. And the Tsuba is also completely tight. There's no wiggle to it at all. Now, one interesting thing here is the seppa. I was originally going to say these are your normal Longchuan seppa, but they're not. They're very slightly different. Most Longchuan katana seppa have that texture on the edge that goes into the edge. Here it's just cut into the top and bottom of the seppa, but not all the way through to the edge. It doesn't make a big difference. It's a slight difference that you really only notice if you look closely. And the habaki is a very standard brass one. It's very typical of your Longchuan budget habaki in that the mune side does not stick out over the blade. Ideally, you want the habaki to be where the tension is in the saya. And so you want it to have a little bit of a raised lip over the blade to protect the blade from rubbing against the saya, and instead have the habaki take that rubbing. In this case, the blade stands a tiny bit higher than the habaki. Again, this is very, very normal on most Longchuan katana and not something I would expect to see done traditionally at this price point. But overall, the habaki does fit the blade pretty well. There's not huge gaps on the planes here at all, which is very common on budget katana. So the habaki here is well chosen for this blade. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So this is a pretty light katana, pretty narrow, and has pretty much no niku to it. So it's while it has a good thickness starting at around 7 millimeters at the munemache and featuring good distal taper throughout, it doesn't have much niku. Like I said, it's a very narrow blade at the edge, which makes it a little bit more delicate, a little bit better of a cutter, but probably a little bit less durable and a little less accurate to what katana were, generally speaking, made to be like historically. This is something very common with a lot of Chinese katana makers. They tend to favor katana with less niku. My hunch is because that makes the sword a little bit more lively, a little bit better of a cutter, and therefore it appeals to the modern audience more, who, generally speaking, are not going to be using these in tough ways where Niku is more important. I do know that if you order something from RyanSword, though, you can certainly ask for Niku and they will oblige you. It's just this one, and I think generally speaking, a lot of their stock models are going to be pretty low to no Niku at all. So RyanSword lists this katana as being made from 1095 steel, which is a perfectly good steel for a katana. I have no way to test that, but I also have no reason to doubt it. It is differentially hardened with a very simple hamon, but it is a legitimate hamon. It is not wire brushed on, and it's a Saguha style, which is basically just a straight line. One thing that RyanSword could improve on is the geometry here at the Kisaki, especially the hamon. The hamon is supposed to kind of curl back on onto the spine of the blade a little bit, and it doesn't do that here. Not a huge deal, but it would be something that it would be nice to see. Continuing with the Kisaki, the Yokote, this little line here where the polish changes, is purely cosmetic. In a traditional katana, this would actually have a geometry change at that line. Not the case here. Again, budget sword, you don't really expect that geometry change. In addition, the polish here is not traditional because you would normally see the Kisaki on a traditional katana burnished in a very specific way to look quite different. Here, it's basically just polished in a different direction to give the appearance of that. Again, very low cost. This is not a criticism, I'm just pointing it out. One thing I do like is that the hamon has that milky white color to it. A lot of times on a lot of budget katana, you will see the hamon be the brightest, the shiniest part of the blade, and then the milky color being more on the shinogi-ji part. Whereas here it is more traditional look of the hamon having that kind of milky color to it. We also have on one side of the blade a horimono engraved or etched, I'm going to say etched, into the blade here. I think this is representative of a fu dog, but I'm not really sure. I'm relatively confident that it is inspired by the Kill Bill katana, and that's why they put it on there. It looks nice enough. It gives a little bit more attention or a little bit more detail to look on the blade. I will say though, when I am oiling the blade, the cloth likes to stick on the edges of the horimono, so I have to be a little careful to not leave little fibers stuck on the blade after oiling it. Now, one last thing I need to point out about the blade on here is that you will probably have seen during close-ups that in one spot on the edge of the blade there is a very small amount of damage. It's kind of kind of deformed just a tiny, tiny bit. And that damage, I believe, was caused by one of two things. When I was cutting, I cut some fairly thick plastic bottles, but I also at one point hit my stand with a good amount of force. I think one of those two things caused that damage in the edge. Let's test the sharpness of the sword on some paper. And it's important to mention this is after I've already done cutting with this sword and after it took that very slight damage to the edge, very, very slight. So that could impact its ability to cut paper. And as always, this is not so much about whether the sword can cut paper and testing the edge. It's more about providing context to the cutting footage you're going to see, because this is a standard target that I can draw through, and you can use that to compare how it cuts. So it sliced in there quite easily and took no effort and didn't really tear either. Yeah, very nicely sharpened, very even and smooth cuts on here. No real tearing at all. That little tiny bit of damage to the edge doesn't seem to have affected its ability to cut paper at all. Now let's talk about cutting. And as you just saw, the edge on here is a very effective edge. Even with that small bit of damage, it didn't really affect the paper cutting at all. Let's talk first about tatami. That's what I cut with this sword first. And it cut tatami very, very nicely. Very clean cuts. I did have a couple cuts that weren't particularly clean, but those were my fault because I was both a little bit out of measure, and then I also targeted a little bit too close to a previous cut, so there wasn't really enough material to get a good cut. But when I was on point, this sword cut the tatami very easily, very smoothly, very effective. Going on to water bottles, it cuts them quite well as well. Now let's talk about what I think might have caused the damage to the edge. I think it could have been cutting into any of these water bottles. If I cut into the thick plastic neck of the bottle, that can sometimes cause a little bit of damage to delicate edges. But my hunch is on this syrup bottle. The first cut was through the neck of the bottle. And this syrup bottle is thick plastic, and the neck is going to be the thickest part. I think that is most likely where this sword took a slight bit of damage. The other option would be here, where I just completely missed my target and hit the stand pretty hard. And I don't think that would have caused it, because that 4x4 out there is pine. It's not particularly hard wood, and I just don't think that caused it. I think it's much more likely the syrup bottle did that tiny, tiny bit of deformation in the edge. But even with that, this sword cuts water bottles very well. It cuts tatami very well. It's fun to take into the backyard and cut light targets with it. I don't think I would recommend heavier targets. Like I said, there's pretty much no Niku here, and the edge already has deformed that tiny, tiny bit. So harder targets are probably going to be a little rough on this sword, and probably not what it is designed to do. Let's talk about how this sword handles. Now, if you're familiar with me, you know that I don't practice Japanese swordsmanship. I don't practice EI. I'm much more focused on European swords, but even there, I don't practice any formal schooling. I live out in the middle of nowhere, and there's no swordsmanship schooling available to me. So I have to kind of muddle through with what I can learn on my own and picking up from people online. Now, that's to say that I've used the sword, I've practiced with it, I've cut with it, but I don't do EI. I don't practice Japanese swordsmanship, so I don't know. So this is just kind of a layperson's impressions of how this katana feels. And the first thing I'll say, it's relatively light for a katana at 2 pounds, 7 ounces, right around there, if I remember right. And I think a lot of that is it's a relatively narrow blade. It's thick enough, it starts at right around 7 millimeters, but it's a relatively narrow blade with a decent amount of profile taper for a katana, which means this ends up feeling quite light and nimble. I don't really have a whole lot of sword wind that I can hear. There's some. You're probably getting that better than I am. I know when I'm practicing with this outside, the noise of being outside, even though I live in a quiet area, the noise of being outside pretty much mutes it, and I don't really hear the sword wind. So it's not a great training tool in that regard for me personally. But that depends, whether it would be for you, it depends on do you want a loud sword, do you want a quiet sword? For me, not particularly loud, not particularly great for helping me determine edge alignment. So with my time with this sword, the Ito is held up very well. It's still very nicely tight. None of the fittings have come loose. That's a good thing to see. And overall, it's a quick sword, very easy to cut and stop right where I want it to. Easy to direct the tip where I want the tip to go. Just overall, a very nimble and easy to use katana. And it's balanced, if I remember right, it's around 4 inches from the munemache. And it's a good overall katana for just having fun and swinging around and using. It's not particularly correct to Japanese swords. The blade geometry is definitely more of a Chinese katana than you'll see on actual Japanese nihonto, but that's not a bad thing. This is Again, I keep harping on this during the review. This is a $135 katana. You have to accept compromises with that. And there are compromises here, but it's fun to move around. It's easy to, like, for instance, I can start a cut and then quickly move it to a different cut without any difficulty at all. It's a very easy and fun to move around katana. For a comparison to this RyanSword Kill Bill katana, I have here the Romance of Min Tsurudoi. And I chose this one because it is roughly the same price as this one. They're both very much in the budget-oriented katana range. And this is one of the better budget-oriented katana I have reviewed. I was really impressed by this one. So I figured, let's see how I feel about them compared to each other. So the Tsurudoi is a Anakubi Zukuri, so it feels notably different in the hand. It's about the same blade width, but it's the Anakubi Zukuri geometry, which means it's generally going to have less blade weight than the Shinogi Zukuri with no bohi that the Kill Bill katana has. The Ito on this has been very tight. Everything has been very tightly maintained. And yeah, this is notably quicker. And I'm notably easier to move around. And I'm saying that as, that Kill Bill katana, I find to be quite easy to move around, quite nimble, quite quick. And this is even quicker and nimbler. That said, this has less authority to the blade. For sure, it doesn't have nearly as much presence out here. Not that the Kill Bill katana has a lot. It has considerably more than this. And that's, again, because of the whole Anakubi Zukuri geometry with the way the spine of this blade narrows considerably for the majority of the blade, that takes a lot of weight out of it. And then it also has bohi. I believe this thinner one is called a sohi. So there's a lot of weight taken out of this sword, and you can feel it in its moving it around. So yeah, I pick up the Kill Bill katana immediately. A lot more presence to the sword, a lot more weight throughout the blade, not just out here, like I was saying, but there's more weight down here. I can feel the lack of bohi on this compared to the Tsurudoi, but it's still very nimble, easy to move around, easy to swing. It just has more authority in the cut and is probably a little more representative of what katana feel like, because while this is not particularly a great example of a Shinogi Zukuri, again, more of a Chinese version of Shinogi Zukuri, it's still closer to what the majority of Nihonto are. No bohi, Shinogi Zukuri, relatively, I won't say simple, because katana do not have simple blade geometries, but it's considerably simpler than Anakubi Zukuri, and overall, it's quite a lot of fun to move around. Let's talk about potential improvements, but there's not a lot to talk about here. Could the koshirae be cleaned up better? Yes, but $135. Could the kasaki be shaped a little bit better, have a geometric yokote, have the hamon curl around the way it would on a traditional katana, be burnished correctly? Yes, they could be done like that, but this is $135. Could the sword have some niku to it to give it just a touch more durability and just make it a little bit more traditional? Yes, but again, $135. At that price point, you have to accept little flaws and things that could be improved but can't be because the price would go up. At $135, I don't think there's a lot that could or should be improved here. So bottom line, as I've repeatedly said throughout this review, this sword costs $135. What do you get for that price? Well, you get a sword that is very clearly inspired by the Kill Bill Hattori Hanzo sword. How closely does it match that? I'll leave that up to Kill Bill fans to illuminate, because that's not me. You get a sword that is a lot of fun to cut with, both tatami and water bottles, and that is overall pretty well constructed. Everything's still tight, the Ito is tight, and it's just a competently made katana. And at $135, that is a rare thing indeed. It is not at all uncommon to find katana that have less attention to detail, less quality construction at double to triple the price. But at $135, you get a katana that is well done and is fun to use. So I think it's pretty obvious that I do think this sword is worth the asking price, especially if you're a Kill Bill fan and you like the way it represents that sword. But even if you're not a Kill Bill fan, I don't think this sword screams Kill Bill to people who haven't seen it. It has that kind of understated look that Japanese katana so often do. It's not overly flashy. It's not gaudy. So that's what drew me to it in the first place. I like that more simple look, and it works here. It looks nice and it cuts well, and overall, yeah, I do think it's worth $135. It's not easy to find a good sword at that price range, and this is a good sword. And that's going to wrap up this review. I want to say thank you to RyanSword for sending me this to review. If you are interested in buying one of these, the link will be in the description. It's just a straight link to RyanSword. There's no tracking or any incentives for you to click on that. While you're down there, hit the like button, subscribe, leave a comment, do all those things. They are just so important to helping the channel continue to grow. Until next time, Alien 2.